Hello, I am Justin Greenwood, and I draw The Last Siege for Image Comics. And today I'm drawing the stranger, the mysterious stranger from our story. He's one of the lead characters. The Last Siege is it's a medieval war comic that's kind of framed like a Western. So it starts off really small with a stranger quietly, mysteriously coming into town. He ends up in a conflict that just continues to grow. So throughout the whole series, the conflicts and the stakes just get bigger and bigger until by the end it's just chaos. So Landry came to me with this idea, a story that's just starts small and just builds into complete chaos. And I love the idea of getting to depict war in a very visceral way. And it's not something I'd gotten to do very much of. I've kind of come up doing comics that were more attention-based, and this one was just really kinetic with lots of action. I just thought the framing was really interesting. I got into art. I grew up with it from the very beginning. My dad was an artist. He did custom paint and pinstriping on cars. You know, a real common thing we used to do when I was little is my dad would take me for a ride. He'd buy a lot of magazines. Because of his interest in paint and pinstriping, he would buy car magazines, drag racing, biker magazines. And in Hayward, there was a store, like a little tiny shop they used to sell. I feel like magazine shops are kind of a thing of the past, but that was all that this place had. And we used to go there a lot. I look back and think it was kind of a bonding experience. I think in a lot of ways he was just trying to get his magazines. But I used to love the ride. And when we used to get there, they had an old style spinner rack. And sometimes I'd spend 20 or 30 minutes just looking through everything. So as early as I can remember, I thought, man, it'd be really cool to draw comics. I know it seems sort of like an impossible goal. It's not a very easy job to find your way into, but I always loved doing it. I mean, some of my earliest memories I remember just like drawing on desks at school and all over papers. Like everything I have as a kid is all just riddled with little sketches of like monsters and army men. Like when I graduated high school, I thought, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to try and go to art school and see how it goes. And it took me a long time to get there. For me, that path wasn't really straight. I think I needed to do some living a regular life first before I could be disciplined. And so I didn't probably make my way to actual art school until, I bet you I was in my mid to late 20s. You know, there's a lot about art that I was interested in, but I felt like my first love was comics. Let's start with that and see how it goes. So I went to the Academy of Art here in the Bay Area. I took traditional illustration so that I could kind of do something related. And then when I got out of school, I put my effort into just comics. And I spent a couple of years trying to build a portfolio and learn about the industry, go to shows. I don't know. I don't feel like it's a common way to break in now so much because the social media has changed your ability to be seen in a way that didn't really exist then. I think I bought a computer at the time. I mean, even computers, they weren't new, but like it wasn't such a staple in every household like it is now. And so I built this portfolio and put it together of things that I thought represented the type of art I wanted to do. And, you know, when I first started, it was like basically just like pinups and really random. And then eventually I honed it down into stuff that I liked. And I started trying to find writers who wanted to pitch stuff because I felt like I wanted the samples to feel cohesive. Over a period of a couple of years, I finally put together a portfolio that I thought was pretty solid. And I went around making the rounds to conventions and showing it. And in one of those showings, I finally broke in. I met a publisher who was interested in what I had. They weren't interested in the pitch I had specifically, but they liked the art that I showed them. And that grew into my first comics job. It took probably a year from there. But once I got going, I never really looked back. My first book was Resurrection from Oni Press. I was working with Mark Guggenheim. The series had already debuted, and it was getting ready to come back. And it was actually Oni's first color monthly book that I can remember. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm relatively certain that that's true. And it was kind of crazy because my first comic ended up being a free comic book day issue that was widely read, probably more so than most of the other things I did afterwards for a while. Yeah, I did Resurrection for about a year, and it grew into eventually working on another book with Mark called Stringers. I worked on a book called Stumptown with Greg Rucka, and then that led to eventually working on Diffuse with Anthony Johnson for Image Comics. At the time that I was working on Diffuse and Stumptown, a lot of those projects were specifically crime. Current day or beyond, like Diffuse is set on a space station in the not-so-distant future. And, of course, Stumptown is a PI story in current-day Portland. Since then, I've done a lot of different time periods and different genres, and I'm not sure how that kind of shook out. It started small. I took on a one-off job to do an Alexander Hamilton biography with 10-Speed Press. Sometime in that transition, I agreed to start working on The Last Siege, which is medieval. And the book I'm working on now, I just finished The Last Siege. I'm starting on another project that's also based in history. And I have another one on my desk that's sort of, I guess, fantasy era. It's not specific in the time period, and it's not specifically historical, but it's definitely in a completely different genre and style. I find it really interesting to jump between these things because I think when you're doing the same genre in the same period, it doesn't become stale necessarily, but you do find yourself falling into similar patterns and similar rhythms. And I find that getting to tell a different kind of story in a different kind of place really helps loosen up different creative directions that you might not fall into unless you had something different to look at. And that comes from looking at different reference, working with different writers and different methods of storytelling. I like all the variety. I was working on really long running series, 2 to 3 years at a time. And this last year, too, everything's been smaller in scope, 6 issues, 8 issues. I'm sort of enjoying the opportunity to try out a bunch of different stuff and just see what fits and what's inspiring, what things come across my desk that I haven't tried yet. I think that's what I liked about The Last Seat so much. It was such a change of pace in terms of storytelling from other stuff I've worked on. It's linear. It's one beginning, one end. It starts off at a kind of a slower pacing and then builds and builds. And by the end, it's a ride. And it felt like something I hadn't gotten to try yet. One of the things that got me so excited is how the pacing changes specifically from issue to issue and over the course of this series. When Landry started describing the story and how it sets up Catherine as the heroine, and originally we set it up, feels like it's about the stranger, but honestly, when you go back and read it, it really has more to do with Catherine's evolution as a character too. I thought it was kind of cool that it's basically set up to where there's a impending doom in the form of this king and this army that's present in whispers from the beginning, first issue. Part of the way through, you feel like they're definitely going to show up and this is not going to be good when they do. And then when they finally arrive, there was a movie, High Noon, it was a Western. 3/4 of the movie is just the inference that something bad's going to happen. I really liked that sense of tension. And so I tried to really work hard to build that into this story visually, so that by the time the king comes, the whole pacing changes. In fact, in the middle of this series, the two characters meet for the first time. Stranger, who it's sort of been suggested might have a history with the king, and then this evil warlord king who arrives, and they meet on the battlefield for the first time. And we really wanted to feel like from that point, this book changes, both in terms of the story, but also visually, like there's a big shift. And from there, the war begins, the real war begins, not just the internal fighting within the castle, but that entire little story we've set up gets turned on its head. And so at one point when we were talking about how we were going to frame the war portion, at one point I had considered that the story might be really interesting if the whole thing was told in double page spreads. And all it was just these big visual pieces, big page turns. And although that didn't really suit the story we were telling it as it was in this form, we did feel like that might be a great fit for later on when the actual war portion takes place. And so what we did was we dedicated a single issue just to that. So by the time you got there in issue 7, there's no more talking. In fact, I don't think there's any dialogue in the issue itself. It's just the big master strokes of what happens when an army descends on something that just isn't built to defend itself. Anytime you're doing double page spreads by itself, they're always challenging to get compositions that have rhythm. They lead to page turns, but also are complete images on their own. And having a whole issue of them was really fun for one thing, because you get to draw a lot bigger, but also it was a real challenge. But man, it was awesome. And I feel like it's so different than how the series began, where I'm drawing very careful and trying to invite mystery and question. We get to this point where there's no more mystery, there's no more questions. It's just big and it's bold. And I feel like I tried to lean into a looser handling so that it felt more chaotic. My process has changed over the years. I still think it's very basic. The way I work typically is I'll get a script and I'll read it a bunch of times before I start. The number one thing I'm trying to get a sense for is really how the story feels to me, more so than the specific visual portions. I'll really try and get a good idea of what the intention is and how I'm supposed to feel as I'm reading it, where the big punches are, not literal punches, but just emotional punches, emotional beats. And once I feel like I have a handle on that, I start trying to break it down visually. A lot of times it starts with just sketching on the pages as I'm reading it a bunch of times. After the 4th or 5th time, I feel like I have a handle on that part, and I'll start to just noodle around on little moments or little images that come to mind as I'm sketching. When the time comes to commit, I usually take between 3 and 5 days, and I'll break the whole thing down onto page comps, which are basically just 8.5 by 11 pages turned sideways, so that I can see what 2 pages look like next to each other, how they're going to look in the book. And I'll draw little portions of the pages, and I'll do a lot of revision on that. It's just a point of the storytelling process where I can't listen to podcasts, I can't watch TV, I can't do anything but just sort of do that part. I listen to a little bit of music, kind of quiet. I just got to fall into it. But once I knock that down and I get a handle on what that is going to look like, I'll pass that to the rest of the team and see what they think about it, and kind of kick it back and forth. I usually have a lot of notes. I do tend to overthink it a little bit, but it's important to me that the storytelling has a certain kind of pacing. The actual drawing part of the comic and the physical pages, that part is the fun part. The part that I really obsess about is the storytelling. And I feel like once that's in place, the rest of it is just what's the coolest way to make this to read. And so as a group, once we decide that, okay, this plan works, these comps, they feel like that's a good fit for the story. I usually work in batches of like 4 to 5 pages, and I'll do a bunch of layouts. And my layouts, this is a point where I know working traditionally is kind of crazy versus other people who work digitally, but I'll do my layouts by just blowing up my comps and then lightboarding them onto pages. And as I'm doing that part, I'm kind of improving it from one step to the next. And then I go to pencil it, and then I start looking at the structure, making sure the perspective is right, and making sure that the anatomy is right, and all the nuts and bolts. And once all the penciling and everything's in place in a way that I know is accurate, that's when I start to ink and I really try and loosen up. I get kind of tight at the penciling stage because I really want to make sure all that stuff is making sense. And then once I know that for sure it's making sense, I feel like I can go ahead and kind of undo it and just try and get loose, have fun. I feel inking for me is the reward for all the work of making sure the storytelling's working right. I can usually do a batch of pages in a week, sometimes a little faster and sometimes a little slower. It just depends on how it's going. But yeah, inking for me is the payoff. The inking stage is where all the fun happens. And once it's done, at that point, I'll go through the whole group, look them over, make sure that it's a good fit, and then I'll send them to the rest of our team to see what they think about it before it goes on to the colorist and the letterer. The best advice I would give to somebody who wants to break into comics, at least from the art side of things, I would be 2 parts. It would be, one, if you want to learn to draw better, I would take as much time as you can and just practice constantly. Think about drawing from life and how things actually look and observing, and really always be looking at how things are put together, what shapes interest you, how things actually are. And then on the other side of it, be trying to read as much as you can about the theory of why people choose to make the choices they make. And I feel like something in that combination is where your art will come out of. I mean, it's going to be different for everybody. I can read a million books and I can understand theories and apply them fine, but it's nothing like the learning I get from actually drawing from life and observing things as they are. I feel like if you don't do that, what you risk is just end up drawing the same thing over and over, because your imagination is only going to come up with the same 10 solutions for the problem that you're going to create for yourself constantly. I had an art teacher once who used to talk about that the strongest power an artist can have is the ability to never get bored and always be observing. It's impossible to be bored if you are interested in what's around you all the time. It's kind of like a bug, but once you start to just look at all the different little shapes, every time you're looking at somebody cross their legs, how their pants crease, how their posture looks, the way an animal runs, it sounds very nerdy. You just kind of get obsessed with it, I think. And I think drawing from life really helps both get you interested and also remember what you actually see. Comics is not just drawing well. For the other part of it, I would say learning how to tell a story is its own discipline and its own set of lessons. But the biggest advice I would give to somebody who's trying to learn to tell a story better is that first step of reading a script and getting a sense for how it's supposed to feel. I think that sort of drives everything else. And if you have that strong feeling about it, the rest will just sort of come together. I remember when I first started out drawing comics, my biggest goal was, I want to make the writer happy by being positive that I'm giving them exactly what they asked for. And as I get older, I quickly learned that that lesson's not real. It's not really the case. And in fact, it's only part of the job. I feel like it's much more important to think about what the writer was trying to do, make sure you have a handle on what that intention is, and then think about visually how to do that to the best of your ability. And I think almost always you're going to find a different solution than it was suggested, but one that probably makes everybody happier.